Today I'm going to be talking about an eye tracking study that investigates the effects of the self-view window during video-mediated survey interviews. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Michael Schober. I'd also like to thank the National Science Foundation and the Charles Cannell Funded Survey Methodology for their support of this research, as well as the many people who assisted along the way. People are increasingly using video-mediated communication in both personal and professional domains. There are many popular platforms like Skype, FaceTime, and Zoom. And video-mediated interaction is even replacing face-to-face in various areas with Zoom business meetings, telemedicine, and telepsychiatry, for instance. Now, as people increasingly communicate via video using software like Skype and Zoom, new opportunities for survey interviewing are emerging. Respondents may come to expect that they can participate in survey interviews via any preferred mode or convenient mode, including video. And it may be a tempting option for survey organizations due to the rising costs of face-to-face interviewing and the easy capability of augmenting voice calls with video. Video-mediated interaction offers a mix of features that's different than other face-to-face or audio interaction. It's fully synchronous, like face-to-face and telephone, but not text. There's focused access on facial and visual cues, arguably more so than in face-to-face, though there's not full body visibility or access to the full environment. There's access to audio, as in face-to-face and telephone, and there's physical and social distance, or non-co-presence. There's also access to the self-view window, which is a video image of oneself in the corner of the screen. And this is the feature I'm going to focus on today. So here we can see an example of the self-view where somebody can see their conversational partner, who is this woman, as well as themselves in the corner of the screen. Without the self-view, you can only see your conversational partner. So what we wanted to know is how this self-view window affects respondents' disclosure of sensitive information as a measure of data quality. The finding across the survey literature is that when validating information is available, the more embarrassing or socially undesirable reports and surveys are consistently closer to the truth. We wanted to know how the self-view window affects respondents' feelings of comfort and self-consciousness, and how it affects their gaze behavior, that is, where they look, at the interviewer, at the self-view, or elsewhere. And how do gaze location and duration differ for sensitive versus non-sensitive questions, and more and less socially desirable answers? So this was a laboratory study where respondents were randomly assigned to a self-view condition where they could see themselves and the interviewer, or a no self-view condition where the respondents can only see the interviewer. The study was conducted in the lab to fully control administration. All interviews were conducted in the same two rooms with the respondent in one and the interviewer in the other. The same interviewers were used and they were blind to condition, meaning that they didn't know that some people had the self-view and that others did not. The respondents were not informed that the interviewer was in the same building. Anonymity and confidentiality of the data were assured in the same way in both conditions by the experimenter. And the experimenter left the room once a connection between the interviewer and the respondent had been established. Here we can see the physical setup with the respondent seated in front of the laptop, and he can see the interviewer on the screen. The eye tracker was unobtrusive. It was just a small black bar that sits below the computer screen. And it collects 30 X and Y gaze coordinates per second. We chose this 30 frames per second as opposed to 60 because 60 required that the respondents not move as freely, and we wanted the interaction to be as natural as possible. The interviewers were all doctoral candidates in clinical psychology with notable interviewing experience in clinical settings. They each interviewed about 22 to 30 respondents and used a laptop with a CAI interface and a Skype window. They entered the respondents' spoken responses on the laptop. And again, they did not know that some of the respondents had the self-view and that others did not. 133 respondents were recruited from a Craigslist New York ad with a $20 incentive, and they were randomly assigned to self-view or no self-view conditions. There were no differences between the groups in terms of demographics or self-reported computer or video chat use. The 42 questions were the same as those used in the Lindenthal study, using the same population of New York City Craigslist respondents, and consisted of both sensitive and non-sensitive questions. All questions were taken from U.S. government and social scientific surveys, like the General Social Survey, the Survey of Consumer Finances, and the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. The response options range from categorical to numerical to ordinal, and the reference period ranged from the present time to the past 30 days, to the past 12 months, to the time since the respondent's 18th birthday. And the questions covered a variety of topics, including health and fitness, sexual health and behaviors, alcohol use, personal finances, leisure activities, political activism, and altruistic behaviors. After the interview, respondents completed questionnaires on a different computer in a different room, answering questions about their demographics and computer experience, as well as their experience with the interviewer and the interview itself. So we can see here, these questions are about respondents' sense of co-presence or being there with the interviewer, as well as about how often they felt they were able to answer the questions honestly. They were also presented with textual versions of each interview question and asked to rate how comfortable they were answering the question and how upset they'd be if someone else found out their answer. And lastly, they were given a self-consciousness scale, which asked them to rate the extent to which a number of statements were characteristic of the way they see themselves. So what did we find? Well, I'm going to break down the findings into disclosure with and without the self-view window, feelings of comfort and self-consciousness, and gaze for sensitive questions and answers. So perhaps contrary to what some would expect, the self-view respondents reported more days drinking alcohol and more sex partners since their 18th birthday. This replicates findings from an earlier study that didn't use eye tracking, which suggests that those findings were robust. Something to note is that these univariate analyses were conducted after a multi-level model didn't show an overall effect of self-view on disclosure. Some might expect that the self-view has an overall effect of reducing disclosure, but these results actually show that if anything, the opposite is true. With regards to feelings of comfort and self-consciousness, also replicating the previous lab study, respondents with a self-view reported being less self-conscious during the interview, rated the interviewer as more empathetic, and reported being more self-reflective. Perhaps the self-view window mitigates feelings of self-consciousness and self-presentation concerns, providing respondents with the visual information about how they're presenting to the interviewer. Now, what about gaze for sensitive questions and answers? Well, we had 3 points of interest that were identified using pixel-based coordinates from the eye tracker output. We had the self-view window, at the screen or interviewer, and away from the screen entirely. And so gaze measurements that fit within those 3 regions were counted accordingly and connected with the corresponding question-answer sequence for each participant. So this was done for each row of gaze data, X and Y coordinates at a rate of 30 frames a second, resulting in about 3 million lines of data. In order to decide which questions and responses were sensitive, this is what we did. 10 of the questions were categorized as sensitive based on mode differences on disclosure in the Lindenthal study, which, as I mentioned earlier, was conducted in a similar lab context using a sample of New York City Craigslist respondents. Responses were classified as sensitive if more than 40% of a nationally representative Qualtrics sample rated them as ones they thought most people would find somewhat or very embarrassing to give. So we can see here with this question, we have, how often do you attend religious services? At least once a week, almost every week, about once a month, seldom or never. And based on that 40% cutoff, more frequent attendance is not embarrassing, but less frequent attendance is. Now, before we get into the specific findings, I want to talk a little about the gaze data in general. There was substantial variability. Some respondents effectively never averted their gaze during the interview, and some selfie respondents effectively never looked at the selfie window. Some respondents didn't look at the screen for the entire duration of some question and answer sequences, and some selfie respondents spent over 50% of a question and answer sequence looking at the selfie window. Despite this variability, some very clear patterns emerged. Selfie respondents looked at the selfie window less during question-answer sequences where the questions were sensitive than non-sensitive. Selfie respondents averted their gaze less during sensitive questions than non-sensitive questions, but there was no difference for respondents without a self-view. So taken together, these findings suggest that during a sensitive question-answer sequence, self-view respondents look more at the interviewer, that is, they're averting their gaze less and look less at the self-view window. So this is an example that's captured from the interviewer's screen. So the yellow box shows where the self-view window was on the respondent screen. And this video shows somebody looking at himself more during a non-sensitive question-answer sequence. When the yellow box blinks, he's looking at the selfie window. You can see that there's also points where it looks like he's looking at the selfie window, but based on our measurements, those glances are just outside the window.
Some people seem to follow what's going on in government and public affairs most of the time, whether there's an election going on or not. Others aren't that interested. Would you say you follow what's going on in the government and public affairs most of the time, some of the time, only now and then, or hardly at all?
Most of the time.
And with regards to responses, respondents averted their gaze more during question-answer sequences where the responses were sensitive than question-answer sequences where the responses were non-sensitive. And this effect was the same regardless of whether respondents had a self-view window or not. Now here is an example where there's a question-answer sequence with a sensitive response. We can see that there's no gaze at the self-view for the question-answer sequence, but during the response phase, she averts her gaze.
Which term best describes how you think of yourself? Heterosexual or straight? Homosexual, gay or lesbian? Or bisexual?
Don't say bi. Bisexual.
Which term best describes...
Using respondent's gaze for a particular question and the question's comfort rating as given by that respondent, we found that self-view respondents looked at the self-view window more when answering questions they reported having been comfortable answering than uncomfortable answering. And respondents who looked more at the self-view window reported feeling less self-conscious, less worried about how they presented to the interviewer during the interview, and examined their motives less. Of note, respondents who reported looking at themselves more did in fact look more at the selfie window. So not only does this validate the coordinates, measurements, and gaze calculations, but this relationship suggests that respondents were paying attention to at least some of the post-experimental questions and engaging in accurate self-reflection. Respondents who averted their gaze more reported greater self-presentation concerns as measures of social anxiety and public self-consciousness, and respondents who averted their gaze more also reported a reduced sense of rapport with the interviewer based on ratings of how personal and empathic the interviewer was. So what have we learned? Well, self-view respondents looked more at the interviewer during sensitive questions compared to non-sensitive questions. And self-view respondents who looked more at the self-view window reported feeling less self-conscious and less worried about how they presented to the interviewer, and reported greater comfort answering questions. These findings are consistent with the proposal that the self-view creates a distinct interactional dynamic. In these kinds of survey interviews, it seems to increase respondents' engagement with the interviewer and reduce their worry about self-presentation. This dynamic may then contribute to greater engagement, specifically during sensitive question-answer sequences. All respondents averted their gaze more during question-answer sequences where the responses were sensitive compared to non-sensitive. Respondents who averted their gaze more reported greater self-presentation concerns and reported a reduced sense of rapport with the interviewer. More generally, the findings demonstrate that some face-to-face dynamics can extend to video-mediated interaction. The extent to which this gaze aversion is strategic, that is intended as a communicative signal, or a byproduct, that is a symptom of individual processing, is an open question. And there are many remaining questions. We don't know how these findings generalize to other populations or beyond the lab to video chat at home or on a mobile device. But there are ongoing analyses of the current data set that include further coding of the videos and transcription of interviews, comparing alternate classifications of questions and responses as sensitive and non-sensitive, and looking at gaze close to the self-view window, that is expanding the range of those self-view coordinates. We're also going to look at pupillary changes, changes in pupil size, which often correlate with anxiety and arousal. Nonetheless, our findings show that gaze patterns can be informative about respondents' experience and response processes, and that a default feature of video chat that respondents use regularly, the self-view, changes respondents' experience in significant ways, increasing levels of disclosure, increasing comfort with the interview, and changing where they look. Thank you.